The gray morning light over Weatherfield on Thursday, May 14th, 2026, filtered through the windows of the Rover's return, illuminating a scene of quiet, simmering tension that belied the usual breakfast bustle. Ben Driscoll stood by the bar, his hands trembling slightly as he stared into the open safe, the metallic hollowness of the compartment echoing the void in his stomach. The realization that £2,000 had vanished was a hammer blow, but the weight of it was doubled by the knowledge of who had taken it. He hadn't just lost the money, he was losing his son to a web of manipulation he only half understood. Beside him, Ava Price watched with a mixture of pity and burgeoning fury, her eyes darting toward the door as if expecting Will to walk in and offer a boyish excuse that would never come. Ben's admission that he'd left the safe open after a heated row with Sean felt like a confession of total failure, a lapse in judgment that had provided the final bridge for Will to cross into a life of crime and desperation. The air in the pub was thick with the smell of stale beer and the sharp, clinical scent of cleaning fluid, a domestic backdrop to a family crisis that was rapidly spiraling beyond their control. Maggie stood by the window, her silhouette sharp against the street outside, masking a panic so deep it felt skeletal. She knew that every second Will spent with the stolen cash brought him closer to Megan Walsh, and every second he spent with Megan brought the Driscoll family closer to the precipice of a secret she had buried years ago. Across the cobblestones, the atmosphere at the taxi rank was equally charged. Tim Metcalf sat in the driver's seat of his cab, the engine idling with a rhythmic thrum that mirrored the anxious tapping of his fingers on the steering wheel. He watched Will in the rearview mirror, noting the boy's frantic energy, the way his eyes darted toward the station entrance as if the building itself might grow legs and walk away. Tim felt a heavy, familiar ache in his chest, a resonance with the boy's confusion that he had only recently begun to name. The notification on his phone that the Glasgow train had been cancelled should have been a simple professional update, but Will's insistence on going to the station anyway was the final piece of the puzzle. Tim saw the reflection of his own past in Will's desperate loyalty to an abuser, the same blind adherence to a narrative of love that was actually a cage. He thought of Trisha Marlowe and the decades he'd spent reframing a predatory encounter as a lucky break for a teenage boy. As he pulled the car away from the curb, ignoring Will's demands to speed up, Tim knew that his role today wasn't just that of a driver. He was a survivor attempting to pull another soul back from the edge of the same dark water, even as his own heart raced with the fear of a confrontation he had avoided for a lifetime. Meanwhile, the shadow of the Theo Silverton murder investigation continued to stretch over the street, turning neighbors into suspects and homes into interrogation rooms. At number 8, the air was brittle. David Platt stood in the kitchen, his posture defensive as he faced Jodie, whose presence in the house had become a suffocating constant. The demand for her to move out was met not with compliance, but with a calculated, venomous retaliation. Jodie's voice was a low, dangerous purr, as she began to sow the seeds of doubt in Shona's mind, twisting the details of a previous bedroom incident into something far more sinister. She didn't need to shout to cause damage, she simply had to whisper the right lies, letting Shona's imagination do the rest of the work. David watched his life's stability fracture in real time, the look of growing uncertainty on Shona's face more painful than any physical blow. When Jodie eventually stalked out, her expression darkened into a mask of pure malice. She didn't have a place to stay, but a chance encounter with Ken Barlow provided the opening she needed. Overhearing Ken discuss Daniel Osborne's supposed holiday in the Lake District, Jodie's mind whirred with the predatory efficiency of a shark. She knew Daniel wasn't away, and she knew exactly how to use that knowledge to secure a roof over her head, regardless of who she had to blackmail to get it. The tension shifted to the more vulnerable residents as the morning progressed. In the Victoria Gardens, Sam Blakeman sat on a bench, his beloved telescope resting on his lap like a wounded pet. The excitement he had felt about the upcoming meteor shower had been extinguished by Hope's sharp refusal to accompany him, leaving him feeling small and isolated in a world that suddenly felt too loud. When he saw Will emerging from a nearby classroom, the older boy's face was a map of cruelty and pressure. The look Will gave him wasn't just one of teenage bravado, it was a warning, a physical manifestation of the threat, Megan Walsh represented to anyone who dared to glance toward the truth. When Will lunged, the sound of the telescope hitting the ground, the sickening crack of glass and metal shattered more than just an instrument. It broke Sam's fragile sense of safety. He ran, his breath coming in ragged gasps, the ginels of Weatherfield transforming from familiar shortcuts into a labyrinth of shadows. Roy Cropper, out for a morning walk, found the boy later, trembling and clutching a tracking device he'd discovered tucked into the lining of his school bag. The sight of the small, blinking piece of technology was a chilling reminder that the reach of the street's villains extended far beyond the visible horizon. Down at the police station, the clinical white lights of the interview room offered no comfort to Megan Walsh. Detective Lisa Swain sat across from her, her expression unreadable, but her questions sharp as a surgeon's blade. The allegation from Will that he had been groomed into a sexual relationship was met with Megan's adamant, practiced denials. She painted herself as the victim of a confused teenager's fantasy, her voice steady, even as she was grilled about the 2,000 pounds and the planned escape to France. But the walls were closing in. Lisa and Kit had already discussed how Gary Windas's alibi for the night of Theo's murder was beginning to crumble, and the pressure to close multiple cases was mounting. Megan knew she needed a leverage point, and she found it in the one person she could still reach: Maggie. Driscoll. Using her one permitted phone call, Megan reached out to the Driscoll matriarch with a desperation that was purely transactional. She didn't ask for help. She demanded it, using the secret of Alan Driscoll's death as a garrote. If Maggie didn't convince Will to retract his statement, the truth about what really happened to Ben's father would be splashed across the front page of the Gazette. Maggie hung up the phone, the silence of the room feeling heavy enough to crush her, her mind racing toward the inevitable moment of confession that she knew she could no longer postpone. The chapter reached its emotional peak at the Builder's Yard flat, where Daniel Osborne's attempt at isolation was violently interrupted. He had been hiding in plain sight, letting the street believe he was miles away while he nursed his own guilt and trauma. When the door clicked open and Jodie stepped in, he was momentarily paralyzed by the sheer audacity of her intrusion. Her excuse about finding a spare key on the pavement was so flimsy it was insulting, and Daniel's order for her to leave was immediate and sharp. But Jodie didn't move. She stood her ground, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial level as she reminded him of the consequences of his family finding out he'd lied about his whereabouts. She didn't just want a bed, she wanted power, and Daniel, already weakened by his own secrets, found himself unable to push back. As she began to unpack her few belongings, making herself at home in his sanctuary, the power dynamic of the street shifted once again. The police were already gathering evidence outside, collecting scaffolding poles that might have been used in the Silverton murder, unaware that a new, equally dangerous alliance was being forged just a few feet away. The air was thick with the scent of rain and impending disaster, a prelude to the revelations that were about to tear the Driscoll family apart and change the face of Coronation Street forever. Maggie Driscoll's hands were steady as she closed the heavy curtains of the pub's private quarters, but the stillness was an illusion, a fragile shell protecting a core of pure, unadulterated terror. The phone call from Megan Walsh had been more than a threat. It was an invitation to a funeral, specifically, the funeral of the life Maggie had carefully constructed for her son and grandson over the last decade. She looked at the photograph of Ben on the mantelpiece, taken the day he took over the Rovers, his face glowing with a pride that had been hard-won after years of drifting. If the truth about Alan's death came out, if Ben realized that his mother had played a part in the silence that followed that final, violent night, the pride would turn to ash. Maggie knew she couldn't let Megan win, but she also knew she couldn't let Will be the sacrificial lamb for her past sins. The weight of the 2,000 pounds stolen from the safe felt like a physical burden on her soul, a down payment on a debt that she had hoped would never be called in. She sat down at the small writing desk, the mahogany surface cold against her skin, and began to draft a letter she hoped she would never have to send, her pen scratching across the paper with a desperate, frantic energy that mirrored the storm gathering over the red wreck. Outside, the weather had finally broken, and a heavy, gray drizzle began to coat the cobbles of Coronation Street, turning the world into a smudge of charcoal and slate. Tim Metcalf stood by his taxi at the station, his breath hitching in his chest as he watched Will pace the platform. The boy looked smaller than he had an hour ago, his bravado stripped away by the cold reality of a cancelled train and a world that refused to cater to his desperation. Tim approached him slowly, his palms open, his voice low and devoid of the usual banter. He spoke not to the thief or the runaway, but to the version of himself he saw reflected in the boy's wide, haunted eyes. He told Will about Tricia, about the way a predator makes you feel like the only person in the world who matters right before they take the world away from you. Will tried to lash out, his words sharp and defensive, but the fight was draining out of him. The 2,000 pounds in his pocket felt like lead, a reminder of the father he had betrayed for a woman who was currently bargaining with his grandmother's soul. When Will finally slumped onto a wooden bench, burying his face in his hands, Tim sat beside him in silence, letting the rain soak through his jacket, a silent sentinel against the darkness that was trying to pull the boy under. In the back room of Roy's Rolls, the atmosphere was clinical and tense as Roy and Dee Dee Bailey examined the tracking device found in Sam's bag. The tiny piece of plastic and circuitry was a bridge between the digital world and the physical threats lurking in the ginnels. For Sam, it was a confirmation of his worst fears that he was being watched, quantified, and hunted. Roy's usual calm was replaced by a sharp, protective focus, his mind cataloging the possible implications for the Silverton investigation. He knew that Megan Walsh was capable of sophisticated manipulation, but this level of surveillance suggested a broader network of influence. Dee Dee's legal mind was already racing, connecting the dots between the tracker, the stolen money, and the intimidation of witnesses. She realized that Megan wasn't just a rogue teacher, she was a cornered animal with the resources of someone much more dangerous behind her. As Sam watched them, his initial fear began to harden into a quiet, cold resolve. He realized that the telescope Will had broken wasn't just a toy. It was a symbol of his ability to see the truth from a distance. If he couldn't look at the stars anymore, he would look at the street, and he would find the proof they needed to stop the people who were making his friends disappear into shadows of their former selves.